The cowboy's horse came home through the blizzard alone, but the woman he married without love rode straight into the storm. Snow whipped across Autumn's face as she tightened her grip on the reins. Caleb's horse stood trembling near the gate, saddle dusted white, no rider in sight. The wind screamed through the valley. Then she spotted something strange in the snow, a line of fresh tracks leading away from the broken fence. She stared into the darkness for one heartbeat and made a choice she could never take back. If you're watching, tell me where you're joining from today. Autumn Brooks heard her future being sold for $80. She was carrying a tray of clean plates down the back hallway of the boarding house in Dodge City when she heard the voices coming from the kitchen office. The door stood open a few inches. Lamplight spilled across the floorboards. Her stepfather, Ezekiel Brooks, laughed first. Then another man answered. Horace Finch. Autumn knew the voice. Most people in town did. He owned the slaughterhouse near the rail yard. He wore expensive coats, polished boots, and the look of a man who believed everything had a price, including people. Ezekiel folded something on the desk. Money. You'll have her by the end of the month, he said. Horace grunted. You make sure she doesn't get any ideas. Autumn stood frozen. The plates suddenly felt heavy in her hands. She won't, Ezekiel said. Girl's got nowhere else to go. The men laughed softly. Autumn backed away before the floorboards could betray her. She carried the plates to the pantry, set them down, closed the door. Then she stood there in the dark. Not crying, not moving, just listening to her own heartbeat. Her mother had been gone nearly 3 years. Since then, every room in that small house had belonged to Ezekiel. Every decision, every dollar, every day. And now her future. Outside, a train whistle echoed across town. Long, low, lonely. Autumn opened her eyes. That sound became the only thing she could think about. An hour later, she was sitting on her narrow bed beneath the slanted ceiling of her rented room above the boarding house. Everything she owned fit into a worn leather bag. 2 dresses, a brush, a photograph of her mother, 3 silver dollars, and a newspaper clipping folded so many times the edges were beginning to tear. She unfolded it carefully. Rancher seeks lawful wife for practical arrangement. Need not bring dowry. Honest intentions preferred. Caleb Dawson, Eagle Ridge Ranch, Bitter Creek Valley, Wyoming. No promises, no poetry, no talk of love, just plain words. For reasons she could never fully explain, those words felt safer than anything Horace Finch had ever said. Autumn stared at the advertisement. Then she looked at her mother's photograph. You always told me to keep moving when the road behind me closes, she whispered. The room stayed quiet, but somehow the answer felt clear. By midnight she had packed. By 1 o'clock she had slipped down the back staircase. The streets of Dodge City were nearly empty. A lantern burned outside the saloon. A dog slept beneath a wagon. Cold autumn wind rolled dust across the road. Autumn walked quickly toward the train station. Every sound behind her made her look over her shoulder. Every shadow felt dangerous. At the ticket window, she pushed nearly all her money through the opening. 1 ticket north, she said. The station clerk looked at her. That's about as far as this money will take you. Then that's far enough. The train arrived 10 minutes later. Steam hissed into the night. Passengers climbed aboard. Autumn stepped onto the platform and found a seat near the rear of the car. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. The conductor called the departure. The engine groaned. The train began to move, slowly at first, then faster. Autumn looked through the window. The station drifted past. The platform, the freight crates, the water tower. Then 2 figures appeared running toward the tracks. Ezekiel Brooks and Horace Finch. Her stomach dropped. Horace pointed directly at the departing train. Even through the glass, she saw the fury on his face. He shouted something. The wind stole most of the words, but not all of them. "I'll find you!" Several passengers turned. Autumn didn't. She kept her eyes forward. The platform shrank into darkness. The town disappeared. The prairie opened beneath a sky crowded with stars. For the first time in years, nobody knew exactly where she was. That should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt terrifying. Because freedom and fear sometimes arrive together. Autumn rested her head against the cool glass. The train rattled north through the darkness. Toward Wyoming. Toward a cowboy she had never met. Toward a marriage she did not understand. Toward a future balanced on $3 silver and 4 lines in a newspaper. Outside, the prairie rolled endlessly beneath the moon. And somewhere far beyond the darkness, Eagle Ridge Ranch waited. The train crossed into Wyoming 2 days later. By then, Autumn Brooks had learned the sound of every wheel beneath her seat, and every whistle echoing through the cold morning air. She slept little, ate only when she had to. Most of her time was spent looking through the window. The land kept changing. Kansas gave way to open plains, then rolling grasslands, then stretches of country that looked untouched by anything except wind. When the conductor finally called Dry Hollow, she almost missed it. The town seemed to appear out of nowhere. A few buildings, a feed store, a blacksmith shop, a church with white paint peeling from the boards, a water tower leaning slightly to one side. Nothing more. Autumn stepped off the train carrying her worn leather bag. The platform was nearly empty. For a moment she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Then she saw him. A tall man standing beside an old wagon near the end of the platform. Hat pulled low, brown coat, dust on his boots, still as a fence post. Caleb Dawson. He didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't hurry toward her. He simply watched. Autumn walked across the platform. The wind tugged at her coat. When she stopped in front of him, Caleb glanced at the bag in her hand, then at her face. His eyes were gray, quiet eyes, the kind that looked like they had spent years staring across open country. "You traveled alone?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded once. No surprise, no praise, just acknowledgement. Then he took her bag, not gently, not rudely, just practically. The wagon creaked as they left town. Dry Hollow disappeared behind them. Neither spoke much. The road wound through dry grass and scattered cottonwoods, turning gold with autumn. A hawk circled overhead. Somewhere far off, cattle moved like dark dots across the land. Autumn folded her hands in her lap. She had imagined this moment many times. None of those versions had included silence. Finally, Caleb spoke. "I'll say this now so there's no misunderstanding." She turned toward him. His eyes stayed on the road. "I don't need a sweetheart." The wagon wheels rattled over a patch of stones. "I need someone who won't run when life gets difficult." Autumn looked ahead. The horizon stretched forever. "I didn't come here looking for romance," she said. Something moved across his face. Not quite approval, but close. "Good." That was all. An hour later, Eagle Ridge Ranch came into view. The house sat on a rise overlooking the valley. Weathered wood, wide porch, large barn, long fencing running toward distant hills. It wasn't grand, but it felt solid, like it had survived many winters. The wedding took place that afternoon. Pastor Amos Reed stood inside the church. Martha Jenkins from the general store sat in the front pew. 2 ranch hands served as witnesses. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. The pastor asked his questions. They answered. Papers were signed. A ring was placed on Autumn's finger. No music played. No flowers decorated the room. When it was over, Caleb shook Pastor Reed's hand. Martha hugged Autumn briefly before stepping back. The town moved on with its day. as if practical marriages happened every Tuesday. By sunset, they were back at Eagle Ridge. Caleb carried her bag inside. The house smelled faintly of coffee grounds, leather, and wood smoke. Everything was clean, orderly, quiet, too quiet. There was a clock above the fireplace. Its ticking seemed louder than it should have been. Caleb showed her a room at the end of the hallway. The blankets are in the chest. She nodded. The wash basin is outside the door. Another nod. If you need anything, I'll be in the barn. Then he left. Just like that. Autumn sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress creaked beneath her. Late sunlight filtered through the window. Golden dust floated in the air. Somewhere outside, a gate closed, then another. She listened to the sounds of a ranch settling into evening. This was her home now, at least for the moment. After unpacking, she wandered through the house. The kitchen was spotless, the pantry carefully arranged. Every tool hung exactly where it belonged. Nothing felt neglected, but nothing felt lived in either. The house reminded her of a watch. Everything worked. Nothing breathed. As she passed a partially open door near the front room, she noticed a desk inside. Ledgers, maps, land documents, a lantern, and a small wooden box. The lid stood open. Inside rested a woman's ring. Simple, elegant, clearly treasured. Autumn froze. For a moment she simply looked. The ring seemed strangely lonely sitting there by itself. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned. Caleb stood in the doorway. Neither spoke. His eyes moved to the box, then to her. Slowly, he crossed the room, closed the lid, picked up the box, placed it inside a desk drawer. The movement was calm, careful, final. Autumn lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. It's fine. But it wasn't really. She could hear it in the space between the words. Whoever the ring belonged to still lived somewhere inside this house. Inside him. Caleb opened the ledger on the desk. The conversation was over. Autumn nodded and quietly stepped into the hallway. Outside, darkness settled across Bitter Creek Valley. The wind moved through the grass. A coyote called somewhere far away. And for the first time since leaving Dodge City, Autumn realized something important. She had escaped Horace Finch. She had escaped Ezekiel. But she had entered a different kind of unknown. A marriage built on necessity. A house full of silence. And a husband carrying a past he clearly wasn't ready to share. Far beyond the windows, winter waited beyond the mountains. And neither of them yet understood how much would change before it arrived. October settled over Bitter Creek Valley one cold morning at a time. The cottonwoods along the creek turned gold first. Then the grass faded. Then the nights began arriving earlier than they should. Life at Eagle Ridge found its rhythm. Caleb left before sunrise. Autumn usually heard the front door close while the sky was still dark. She would rise a few minutes later, pull on her boots, and step into a kitchen that somehow always felt ready before she arrived. The fire was never completely out. Fresh wood always sat beside the stove. The coffee pot was always cleaned and waiting. No notes, no explanations, just small things already done. At first she assumed he did them out of habit. Later she wasn't so sure. One afternoon she found 3 years of supply receipts bundled together beneath a shelf in the pantry. Flour orders, feed invoices, blacksmith bills. The papers were organized by month, but never totaled. Autumn carried them to the kitchen table. For 2 evenings, she worked by lantern light, adding columns, comparing costs, marking waste. When Caleb came inside on the 3rd night, she slid a sheet of paper toward him. You've been paying too much for oats. He looked down, then back at her. The Miller brothers? She nodded. They raised prices twice. He studied the figures. For a moment she thought he might argue. Instead, he folded the paper and slipped it into his shirt pocket. The next week, a different supplier delivered the feed. Nothing was said. But Autumn noticed. A few days later, one of the ranch horses developed a swelling above its hoof. The ranch hand looked worried. Caleb looked thoughtful. Autumn knelt beside the horse and carefully examined the leg. "My mother taught me this," she said. She mixed warm water and salt in a bucket, applied a compress, changed it twice a day. Within a week, the swelling eased. The horse returned to work. Again, Caleb never thanked her. But the following morning, she found the loose porch railing repaired, a repair she had mentioned only once, in passing, to nobody. The realization stayed with her. Caleb listened, even when he appeared not to. The weather turned colder. One morning, Autumn came downstairs and stopped. A heavy wool blanket hung over the drafty kitchen window. The cold breeze she hated was gone. She ran her fingers across the fabric. The stitching was rough, clearly done by hand, clearly done recently. She looked through the window toward the barn. Caleb was already working, a hammer rising and falling in the distance. She smiled despite herself. The town noticed changes too. Not everyone liked them. Dry Hollow was small. Small towns always watched, always talked. At Martha Jenkins's general store, conversations often quieted when Autumn entered. Not hostile, but curious, measuring, evaluating. One afternoon, she stepped inside for flour and lamp oil. Two women near the counter lowered their voices. A rancher loading supplies outside glanced through the window. Autumn kept walking, kept her shoulders straight, paid for her things. Martha handed over the receipt, then added an extra sack of sugar. "You forgot this." "I didn't buy sugar." "I know." Martha winked. "Take it anyway." It was the first kindness Autumn had received from someone in town, the kind that settled quietly in the heart. Not far from the store, another pair of eyes watched. Wade Mercer, owner of the neighboring ranch. He stood beside his wagon with a cigar between his fingers, watching, always watching. A week later, one of the ranch hands mentioned hearing rumors. According to Wade, Caleb's new wife was only interested in land. According to Wade, she'd leave as soon as something better appeared. According to Wade, Eagle Ridge wouldn't survive winter anyway. Caleb said nothing when told. He simply kept repairing fence posts. But Autumn noticed his jaw tighten. Only once. Then it disappeared. The first snowfall came early, only a dusting, barely enough to whiten the hills. That evening, Autumn entered the study looking for an account ledger. The desk drawer stood partially open. Inside rested the wooden box, the same one she had seen weeks earlier. She hesitated, then opened it. The ring caught the lantern light. Beneath it lay an old photograph. A young woman stood beside Caleb, both smiling, both younger. On the back, someone had written, "Rebecca Hale. Spring, 1884. Autumn stared. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. She quickly lowered the photograph. Caleb stopped in the doorway. His eyes immediately found the box. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then something unexpected happened. He walked into the room, sat down, and looked at the photograph himself. "She left 6 days before the wedding." His voice was calm, almost too calm. The ranch was failing. Autumn waited. The bank wanted payment. The cattle prices dropped. She decided she wanted a different life. His thumb brushed the edge of the photograph. I couldn't blame her. The words sounded practiced, as if he had repeated them for years. Autumn looked at him. "You still keep the ring." A faint smile touched one corner of his mouth. Not happiness. Memory. "I forgot how to throw it away." The room went quiet. Outside, wind pushed against the house. Autumn carefully closed the box. She finally understood. The silence. The distance. The caution. None of it had started with her. It had started years ago. That night they ate supper together. Not much conversation. But the quiet felt different. Less like a wall. more like a bridge still being built. Later, long after dark, someone knocked on the front door. 3 sharp raps. Caleb opened it. A rider from town handed over an envelope, then disappeared into the night. Autumn watched from the kitchen doorway. Caleb read the letter. His expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. "What is it?" she asked. He handed her the paper. The letter had come from Kansas. The message was short. Horace Finch had been asking questions, asking about trains, asking about Wyoming, asking about a woman named Autumn Brooks. The blood drained from her face. The room suddenly felt colder than the weather outside. And somewhere beyond the dark hills of Bitter Creek Valley, trouble had already started moving toward Eagle Ridge Ranch. Winter arrived early that year, not all at once. It came in pieces. A hard frost on the water trough, thin ice along the creek, wind that slipped beneath coat collars and stayed there. The letter from Kansas remained folded inside Caleb's desk drawer. Neither of them mentioned it often. They didn't need to. Its presence lingered in the house like an approaching storm. November passed with long days of preparation. Firewood was stacked beside the barn. Feed was counted twice. Fence lines were checked before every snowfall. Autumn noticed Caleb working longer hours than usual. Sometimes she saw the lantern still burning in the barn after midnight. Sometimes she woke before dawn and found his coffee cup already empty. The first major storm arrived 3 days before Christmas. Dark clouds gathered above the mountains. By noon, the sky had turned the color of old iron. Snow began falling shortly after. At first, it seemed harmless. Then the wind arrived. By late afternoon, the drifts were already climbing against the fence posts. Caleb came inside only long enough to pull on a heavier coat. The north pasture needs checking. Autumn looked through the window. Snow raced sideways across the yard. "Tonight? The cattle are up there." She nodded. There was no arguing with a rancher's responsibilities. Caleb finished his coffee, pulled on his gloves, then paused. A small hesitation, barely noticeable. "Keep the fire going." Autumn met his eyes. "I will." He gave one short nod and stepped into the storm. The front door closed behind him. The house seemed instantly larger and quieter. Evening arrived early beneath the clouds. The wind rattled the windows. Snow tapped against the glass. Autumn tried reading, tried sewing, tried organizing the pantry. Nothing held her attention. Every few minutes she found herself looking toward the road, waiting. At 9 o'clock she lit another lamp. At 10 she added more wood to the stove. At 11 she stepped onto the porch. The storm swallowed everything beyond a few yards. No lantern, no horse, no Caleb. Only white darkness. Shortly after midnight she heard hoofbeats. Relief rushed through her. She hurried outside, then stopped. The horse standing near the gate wasn't carrying anyone. Caleb's horse. Alone. Its saddle was covered in snow. Its reins dragged near the ground. For a moment Autumn couldn't move. The wind howled across the valley. The horse lowered its head and stood trembling. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The next morning the storm showed no signs of stopping. Several men from town rode out searching. They returned before noon, empty-handed. Pastor Amos removed his hat. Nobody said the words. Nobody needed to. Most believed Caleb would not survive another night out there. Autumn listened, then quietly walked back into the house. She pulled on her thickest coat, wrapped a wool scarf around her neck, filled a saddlebag with matches, blankets, and food. Martha Jenkins appeared at the door. "What are you doing?" Autumn tightened the saddle strap. "I'm going after him." Martha stared. "By yourself?" "Yes." The older woman looked toward the storm, then back at Autumn. Finally, she reached into her pocket and handed over a small flask. "For the cold." Autumn accepted it. No speeches, no dramatic farewell. Just understanding. An hour later, she rode north. Snow stung her face. The world had become a blur of white and gray. She followed the tracks left by Caleb's horse as far as she could, then followed instinct, then hope. Hours passed. The daylight faded. Twice she nearly turned back. Twice she kept going. Near dusk she found the broken section of fencing. Several posts had been deliberately damaged. Not weather, not accident. Someone had done this. The realization settled heavily inside her, but there was no time to think about it. A quarter-mile beyond the fence, she spotted something dark beneath a stand of pines. A horse, then a fallen tree, then Caleb, his leg pinned beneath the trunk, his face pale from cold and exhaustion. When his eyes opened and found her standing there, disbelief crossed them. "Autumn?" She dropped beside him. "I found you." The faintest smile touched his face. "I can see that." Together they managed to free his injured leg, but walking was impossible. The storm had returned, harder than before, so they stayed where they were, sheltered beneath the pines. Autumn gathered branches, built a small fire, wrapped blankets around him. When the flames finally caught, orange light flickered across the snow. For a long time neither spoke. The wind filled the silence. Then Caleb stared into the fire and said quietly, "I thought you'd have left long ago." Autumn looked at him. The flames reflected in his gray eyes. "I thought the same about you." Something changed between them then. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough to make the darkness feel less lonely. They sat beside the fire through the long winter night, and when dawn finally arrived, pale and cold across the valley, Autumn noticed something near the damaged fence line below. Footprints. Not hers, not Caleb's, not old. Fresh. Human. Someone had been there before the storm. Someone had wanted those cattle loose, and someone had nearly cost Caleb Dawson his life. The ride back to Eagle Ridge took most of the day. Caleb sat stiffly in the wagon, his injured leg stretched across a folded blanket. Autumn drove while snow drifted across the valley in long white ribbons. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. The storm had changed something. Not loudly, not all at once. But the silence between them no longer felt empty. By the time they reached the ranch, Martha Jenkins was waiting on the porch with a kettle of coffee and a worried expression. Dry Hollow had already heard the news. Small towns always did. For the next 2 weeks, Caleb rarely left the house. The doctor from town ordered rest. Caleb disliked the idea immediately. Autumn ignored his complaints. Every morning she changed the bandage. Every afternoon she checked the stove and carried fresh firewood inside before dark. Every evening she placed supper on the table and pretended not to notice when Caleb watched her from across the room. One morning she caught him looking. He glanced away first. That small detail stayed with her longer than she expected. The footprints near the broken fence stayed on Caleb's mind. As soon as he could walk with a cane, he rode into town. By sunset, he returned with answers. Wade Mercer had been seen near the north pasture the day before the storm. One ranch hand had watched him leave the area after dark. Another remembered fresh tool marks on the damaged fence posts. The pieces fit together too neatly. But before Caleb could confront Wade, another visitor arrived. Horace Finch. The black carriage rolled into Dry Hollow on a cold afternoon beneath a gray sky. People stopped what they were doing. Store owners stepped onto sidewalks. Ranch hands paused in the street. Horace climbed down carrying a leather document case. He looked exactly as Autumn remembered. Expensive coat. Polished boots. A man used to getting what he wanted. The gathering outside the sheriff's office grew larger by the minute. Autumn stood beside Caleb. Horace removed several folded papers. "I've come for my future wife." The words landed heavily. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Autumn felt every eye turn toward her. Sheriff Nolan examined the documents. Old agreements, receipts, Promises made between Horace and Ezekiel Brooks. Nothing that legally forced Autumn to return, but enough to create doubt, enough to make the afternoon ugly. Caleb stepped forward. You made an arrangement with her stepfather. Horace smiled. I paid for one. The smile disappeared from Caleb's face. Sheriff Nolan handed the papers back. She chooses where she goes. Horace looked directly at Autumn. Then choose. The street became quiet. Wind rattled a loose sign outside the feed store. Autumn looked at Caleb. He said nothing. Not because he didn't care, because he believed the choice belonged to her. And somehow that hurt more. The ride home was silent. That evening, Caleb remained in the barn longer than usual. Autumn sat alone in her room. The photograph of her mother rested on the nightstand. The house felt different. Not cold, not unfriendly, just uncertain. For months, she had told herself this marriage was temporary, practical, necessary. But now she wasn't sure what Caleb wanted. He had never asked her to stay. Not really. And fear has a way of filling empty spaces. By dawn, she had packed. The photograph disappeared from the nightstand. The scarf hanging beside the door disappeared too. When Caleb entered the room later that morning, he stopped. The bed was neatly made. The room was empty. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Then he noticed the missing photograph, the missing scarf, the missing bag. Something inside him dropped. Fast, hard. The stagecoach was already leaving Dry Hollow when Caleb reached town. Snow crunched beneath his boots. Passengers were climbing aboard. Autumn stood beside the driver, one hand on the rail, ready to leave. Horace watched from across the street. Half the town seemed to be there. Caleb pushed through the crowd. Autumn! She turned. For a moment, neither moved. The winter wind swept between them. I thought this was what you wanted, she said quietly. Caleb looked at her. Really looked at her. The woman who had crossed half the country. The woman who had rebuilt his house. The woman who had ridden into a blizzard to save his life. No. The word came quickly, certain. I married you to save this ranch. Autumn lowered her eyes. He took another step forward. But the ranch isn't the most important thing anymore. Silence spread across the street. Nobody interrupted. Caleb reached into his coat pocket. The small wooden box appeared in his hand. Autumn recognized it immediately. He opened it. Rebecca's ring rested inside. For years it had remained there. A reminder. A wound. A reason not to trust anyone again. Caleb walked toward the river that cut through the edge of town. The crowd followed. Without a speech. Without drama. He drew back his arm and threw the ring into the water. The silver flashed once in the winter sunlight. Then vanished. Gone. The past finally released. When he turned back, his eyes found Autumn. I'm done waiting for people to leave. Neither noticed the townspeople anymore, or Horace, or the snow. Autumn stepped toward him, then another step, and finally she smiled. Small, real, enough. Spring arrived 4 months later. The snow melted from the hills. Green returned to Bitter Creek Valley. Martha Jenkins insisted on organizing a wedding, a real one this time. The church filled with neighbors. Pastor Amos Reed smiled through the entire ceremony. When Caleb and Autumn spoke their vows, there were no contracts, no arrangements, no conditions, only choice. Later that afternoon, Caleb led Autumn to a new room he had built onto the house. The window faced the sunrise. Warm morning light spilled across the floorboards. On the windowsill sat a small wooden bird, hand-carved, carefully shaped, made during the long winter evenings while his leg healed. Autumn touched it gently, then looked at him. No words were necessary. Outside, cattle moved peacefully across the valley. The mountains stood blue in the distance. And every evening after that, 2 chairs remained on the porch at Eagle Ridge Ranch. The same chairs, the same view. Only one thing had changed. There was no longer any space between them. And maybe that's what stayed with me most about Caleb and Autumn. Not the storm, not the long ride through snow, not even the day he let go of a ring he had carried for years. It was the quiet things. The chair he always pulled a little closer. The way she no longer looked over her shoulder before calling a place home. The way 2 people who had arrived carrying old hurts slowly learned they didn't have to carry them alone anymore. If you put yourself in their place for a moment, what would you have done? Would you have boarded that train with only a few dollars and a fading photograph? Would you have trusted a stranger when life had already given you so many reasons not to? Would you have ridden into a blizzard for someone you weren't even sure loved you back? Most of us will never face those exact choices. But sooner or later, we all come to a crossroads where fear tells us to leave and hope asks us to stay. And sometimes the people who help heal us are not the ones we planned for. They're the ones who quietly show up, day after day, proving who they are through 100 small acts that nobody else notices. That's what this story reminds me of. Real love isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like a light left burning in the window, a chair waiting on a porch, a hand that stays when life gets difficult. I'd love to know your thoughts, so tell me in the comments. What moment in Caleb and Autumn's journey stayed with you the most? And if stories like this make your evenings a little warmer, I hope you'll join us again. There are still more journeys waiting beyond the next horizon, more forgotten roads, and more hearts searching for a place to belong.